They always built the platform too high. Rook had said so, once, to a young priest who'd asked him why he stood at the back. The higher you put the dying, he'd explained, the longer the drop, and the longer the drop the more the body broke when it landed, and a broken body was harder to lay out clean for the right. The priest had looked at him the way they all looked at him, the way you look at a useful disease, and said that the height was so the people could see. So the people could be instructed. Rook had not bothered to answer that the people were not watching the dying. The people were watching him. They were watching him now. He came through the market crowd the way he always came, in the gap that opened ahead of him and closed behind, a moving island of empty ground in a packed square. Mothers turned their children's faces away. A drover spat, carefully, to the side, where it could be a coincidence. An old woman made the old sign against the evil eye and then, catching herself, made the new sign over it, the mercy sign, 2 fingers and a thumb, faith laid down on top of fear like fresh rushes over a stain. Rook noted it. He noticed things. It was a habit the fathers had tried and failed to beat out of him, on the grounds that a sin-eater who thought was a sin-eater halfway to being a problem. He had learned instead to notice quietly. He noticed also the 2 church levies standing at the square's north corner in their dun coats, hands on their short staves, watching the crowd the way men watch for disorder they've been told to expect. Not yet needed. The crowd knew how to behave when church soldiers were present. They had learned that in the last few years, as the pale mercy put down roots. He noticed, for instance, that the woman they were going to hang was not afraid. And he noticed the man too rose back, watching with the particular fixed attention of someone who had been in this square before for a different reason, not a spectator's curiosity but the flat look of a man accounting for something. He might have known her. Rook filed it and moved on. Her name was Marin. He'd been given the parchment that morning, the way he was always given the parchment, the name, the parish, the catalogue of sins he was to take. Father Confessor Aldrich had read it to him over the cold porridge, in the flat voice of a man reading an inventory of grain. Marin of Ostfen. Heresy. The keeping of forbidden practice. The corruption of the sick with old rites. The denial of the weight. That last was the one that mattered. Heresy was a word the church used the way a butcher used a hook, to hang a thing where it could be cut down later. But the denial of the weight, that was the real charge, under all the others. Marin of Ostfen had told people, it seemed, that sin had no weight. That the dead went where they went and no eating of bread changed it. That the whole grave and terrible machinery of the pale mercy, the sin and the shriving and the men like Rook who swallowed the one to grant the other, was a story told to frighten the poor into paying. For saying so, she would die. And then, because the church was merciful and its mercy was thorough, Rook would take onto his own soul the sins of a woman whose only proven sin was saying that sins weighed nothing. He had thought, dimly, on the road, that there was a joke in there somewhere. He hadn't gone looking for it. You didn't, in his trade. You kept your eyes on the bread. They put a sack over her head before the drop, which was a kindness, or looked like one. The crowd went the way crowds went, the held breath, the wanting and the not wanting, the awful animal hush. The priest said the words. The mercy is heavy so that the dead may be light. The hangman, who was drunk and competent, the best combination, did his work, and the platform did what the 2 high platforms did, and then it was over and quiet and Rook had a job to do. This was the part they came to see and could not look at. He climbed up to where they'd laid her. The attendants had already stepped back and the body had already been positioned, they knew the rites requirements by now, the whole square knew them, and the laying out was done with the brisk efficiency of men who had somewhere else to be before the next bell. Someone had already pulled the sack off. You could not eat the sins of a covered face, the rite required the dead be seen, and her face was not so bad as he'd feared, the drop having been merciful in the one way that counted. Middle years. Weathered. A healer's hands, he saw, the nails worn short and clean, the knuckles big with work. He had seen 100 such hands. They belonged to the women you sent for when the fever came in the night and the priest was 3 villages off, the women the church was, this year, deciding to call witches now that it had priests enough to spare. He noticed that. Quietly. Then he stopped noticing, because it was time to work, and the work took everything. He laid the bread on her breast. A flat round loaf, unleavened, still faintly warm from the church ovens, because the rite wanted it warm. He laid the salt on the bread. He put his hands flat to either side of her, the way you'd brace yourself at the edge of cold water, and he spoke the words that were his and his alone to speak, the words they'd carved into him before he had teeth to shape them, and then he took the bread up, and the salt with it, and he ate. And the weight came into him. There is no honest way to say what it was like, and Rook had long since stopped trying, even to himself. It was not eating. The bread was only the door. What came through the door was her, the whole gathered weight of a life's worth of sin, lifting off the cooling body like heat off a stone and pouring down into the dark hold of him where all the others already were, the murderers and the oath-breakers and the men who'd done the unspeakable to children, the great groaning ballast of other people's damnation that he carried so the dead could go clean. He braced for it. You always braced. A heretic's weight, a denier's weight, he expected it heavy and sour, the way the proud ones always were, the ones so sure of themselves they'd argued with God's own church. It came in light. It came in light and cold and wrong, and Rook, who had eaten the sins of 400 dead and had not been surprised by anything in 11 years, stood swaying on a platform built too high with his mouth full of warm bread and tasted nothing where there should have been a life. Not nothing. He made himself be exact, even then, even with the square tilting under him. It was the noticing that saved him, always, the cursed habit they couldn't beat out. Not nothing. There was a weight. But it was the wrong weight, light and accusing and clean, the cold flat weight he'd felt only a handful of times in 11 years and had taught himself, very carefully, not to feel, because he knew, the way a sin-eater comes to know, exactly what it was. It was the weight of someone who had not done the thing they died for. He had a name for it, privately. He'd never said it aloud. He called it the cold coin, that thin, clean, terrible weight, the weight of the innocent, the weight that doesn't sink into the warm sour mass of the truly damned but sits on top of it, separate, refusing to mix, a coin of cold metal dropped into a pot of stew. You couldn't lose it among the others. It stayed itself. He had 4 of them in him now, for cold coins among 400 sins, and he had spent years not counting them. Now there were 5. And worse, because the thin sight came with the weight, the deniable, maybe real, maybe mad whisper of who the dead had been, worse, he felt her last thought come through with the cold coin, clear as a struck bell, the last thought of Marin of Ostfin as the platform took her. I was right. Not afraid. Not raging. Just that, certain and quiet and almost kind. I was right. The denial of the weight. She had said sin weighed nothing and they had hanged her for it, and the last thing she thought as she dropped was that she had been right, and Rook stood there with her cold clean weight settling into him forever and understood, with the flat clarity of a man who has stopped being able to lie to himself, that she had not been right. She had been wrong. Sin weighed everything. He was the proof. He was standing on a platform built too high with 11 years of other men's damnation in his gut, and the weight was as real as the bread, and that was so much worse than her being right, because it meant the machinery worked, the weight was true, the dead did go where their sins sent them. And the church had just used him, used the true and holy and terrible thing he was, to send an innocent woman clean to God and call it mercy while they did it. The crowd was watching him. They always watched this part, the part they couldn't look at, to see if the sin-eater would stagger. He had never staggered. It was a point of pride, the one a man in his office was allowed. Rook swallowed the last of the bread, and the cold coin with it, and did not stagger. The weight settled the way it always settled, folding into him, going quiet. Except that it did not go quite quiet, for a moment, a breath passed where the rite usually closed, something remained, not the coin itself, not a thought, just a faint pressure that didn't belong to him and then, between one heartbeat and the next, was gone. He filed it under the cold, under the height, under 11 years of accumulated noise. He climbed down off the platform built too high, into the gap that opened ahead of him and closed behind, and walked back through the market with 5 cold coins in him and a woman's last certain thought going round and round, and his face gave away nothing, because giving away nothing was the first thing they'd taught him and the only thing he'd never once failed at. But he had started, somewhere on that climb down, very quietly, to count. Father Confessor Aldrich was waiting at the cart, out of the wind, with the next parchment already in his hand. "Clean?" he asked, not looking up. It was the question he always asked. Did the right take, is the dead shriven, is the work done? 11 years, Rook had answered it the same way, clean. One word. The whole of his office in one word. He looked at Aldrich, at the soft hands, the good wool, the parchment with the next name on it, the next sin to be invented and proven and hanged and then handed down to Rook to carry so the church's hand stayed empty, and he felt the cold coin sitting in him, refusing to sink, separate and patient and his now forever. "Clean," Rook said. It came out exactly as it always did. Flat. Certain. Giving away nothing. It was the first lie he had ever told the church, and the terrible ease of it, the way it sat in his mouth no heavier than the 400 truths before it, frightened him more than the cold coin had. Aldrich handed him the next parchment. Rook took it. And as the cart rolled out through the gates of the too-high platform and the market and the watching, spitting, sign-making crowd, Rook of the Pale Mercy, Sin-Eater, 11 years faithful, did the thing the fathers had spent his whole childhood trying to beat out of him, the thing a man in his office must never, ever do. He began to think. End chapter 1. Internal review notes for human reviewer, 400 words, RR length. Goals this chapter, establish the grounded world plus rising church plus the sin-eating doctrine, the weight, diegetically, Rook's voice, perceptive, dry, faithful then cracking, the low/ambiguous supernatural, the weight plus the thin sight, real or a haunted mind. Deliberately unresolved, and the first crack of the redemption arc, the cold coin/the innocence weight/I was right, his first lie, he began to think, a moral fracture he lets himself feel, not a power-up. Open questions, is Rook's voice landing? Does the doctrine come through without infodumping? Does the crack feel earned plus the hook pull to ch2? Any AI tells, over-modification, simile spam, rule of 3 padding, I fought these, flag what leaked. Title, Sin-Eater versus Unshriven versus All the Dead I Carry. Is the cold coin too neat a device or a good recurring anchor?